In this video, obviously, what we're going to do is go ahead and talk about the lymphatic system. Older textbooks would include the lymphatic system as part of the cardiovascular system because sometimes they both are considered to be circulatory in nature. And so not surprisingly, most books nowadays separate them and have a separate, smaller section on the lymphatic system. Okay, there are primary and secondary lymphoid structures, and you should be familiar with the distinction between them. So what I'd like you to do is try and identify those. Pause the video, see what you can do. The primary lymphoid structures include the thymus, which is kind of a thyroid-shaped organ, which is down here in the mediastinum. And as we age, what happens to the thymus is it actually atrophies and gets smaller. And so I don't have much, if any, thymus at all right now. The second primary lymphoid structure is the red bone marrow. Okay? And then we have, I think I just said secondary, but thymus and red bone marrow are primary, and then we have secondary lymphoid structures. And those include the tonsils, the spleen, what's sometimes variously referred to as Galt or Peyer's patches. This is gut-associated lymphoid tissue. Some books actually talk about MALT, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, and they put the tonsils in there as well. And then we have lymph nodes, which you can kind of see throughout the body here, but there are large clusters of these found in the neck, and so those are referred to as cervical lymph nodes. There are others that are in the armpit, and so they're referred to as axillary, and then finally there are some that are near the groin, and those are the inguinal lymph nodes. So again, you can see those clusters, and you know that if you're not feeling well and you go in to have a checkup, the nurse, the doctor, the physician's assistant may actually palpate your neck. They're trying to check and see if those lymph nodes are enlarged or swollen, which would indicate that you are indeed fighting an infection. And if you're particularly sick and your immune system is working really hard, those lymph nodes can be so swollen that they're actually kind of tender and a little painful when they palpate those. Well, which organ systems does the lymphatic system work with? It's actually more or less the link between the cardiovascular system and the immune system, because again, you know that the leukocytes, which are responsible for immunity, are produced in the red bone marrow, and they move into the cardiovascular system, and then from there, they move to the lymphatic system and to connective tissue and to other places. Lymphatic tissue is called lymphatic tissue because lymph will move through there, or we produce lymphocytes in those areas. And then when we look at what's going on, the lymph nodes are actually filtering lymph. That's what's passing through these guys. And it's different when we look at the spleen. The spleen, in fact, is not filtering lymph, but rather it is filtering blood. The functions of the lymphatic system, well, include defense. And so again, the lymphatic system is really part of your immunity, and they produce, maintain, and distribute the leukocytes, which we talked about when we looked at blood, and we'll talk about more again as we go along here. All of the formed elements, where do they originate? And you should say, well, they all originate in the red bone marrow, because in fact, that's what they originate. Here you can see the stem cell, the hematopoietic stem cell, which is responsible for ultimately developing into red blood cells, and the 5 different types of white blood cells, but also platelets, which they haven't included here for some reason. Another function of the lymphatic system is actually to absorb the fat from the small intestine. And you have these villi in the small intestine with capillaries, and this special lymphatic capillary known as a lacteal. These capillaries are not permeable enough to the fatty substance that comes across here. So we've got this little chylomicron. It won't fit in, it won't go into the capillaries, so instead it goes into the lacteal. Eventually that'll make its way into the cardiovascular system and go to the liver to be processed and go to other tissues. The lymphatic system is also important in helping to maintain fluid balance. Your body creates interstitial fluid constantly, and in fact, it creates too much of it, and so the lymphatic system is helping to return that excess interstitial fluid back into the cardiovascular system. At the same time, it can actually be an alternate route for the distribution of hormones and nutrients and waste products. Well, again, here you can see the formation of the lymphocytes. And so now we're focusing on just a couple of the leukocytes. And so we have two major types of lymphocytes. We have T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. And this is nice and easy to remember. The thymus is where the T lymphocytes will mature and develop. Thymus T lymphocytes. The B lymphocytes, on the other hand, they will mature in the bone marrow. So also nice and easy to remember. But bone marrow, B lymphocyte maturation and development. And once they're developed, then they are going to migrate out to the lymphatic system, and we will find them in lymph nodes, we'll find them in the spleen, and we'll find them in other lymphatic tissues, the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, the appendix, places like that. Okay? This is actually all about how we form interstitial fluid. And so here again we have a systemic capillary. More than likely this one is continuous. It's not too leaky, but it is leaky. And then we have these forces that are acting across this systemic capillary. These are known as the Starling forces. And so you see one force here, the hydrostatic force. This is the force of the fluid, in this case the blood, pushing against the wall of the capillary in all directions, trying to get out. And that's what this red arrow is indicating. And now it's not blood that's moving out, it's plasma, so it wouldn't truly be red. The other Starling force is the osmotic pressure, which is primarily due to the albumin that is in the plasma, and it's an inward force. It's trying to hold the fluid in the cardiovascular system, so you can see that the Starling forces are working in opposition to one another. Well, over here at the arterial end of the capillary, the hydrostatic pressure is greater than the osmotic pressure, and we end up forcing fluid out into the interstitial space. And so that's what this is. This is the interstitial space. This is where that interstitial fluid is going to initially go to. So in the interstitial space. As we move across, you can see that blood pressure is decreasing. That also means that the hydrostatic pressure is decreasing. It's dropped quite considerably. Here they're saying that the osmotic pressure remains roughly the same. In fact, it probably will get a little bit greater. And so now you can see that the net result is that we reabsorb some, but not all of the fluid that was formed. So we are going to reabsorb some of it. And so you can see that the net filtration force here is positive 15, moving fluid out. Here, it's negative 9, moving fluid back in. Okay? And so now we can see, we put numbers to this. This, again, is a systemic capillary. Here's the arterial end. Here's the venous end. And this is a lymphatic capillary. Okay, well, how much fluid leaves the cardiovascular system due to those Starling forces over 24 hours? Well, look, 24 liters per day. How much of that is reabsorbed at the venous side? Well, almost all of it, but not quite, 20.4 liters per day. And so what is the difference between what is leaving, the net filtration, versus the net reabsorption? Well, it's 3.6. And so that 3.6 is actually going to be reabsorbed by the lymphatic capillaries. There are lots of those in here, even though they're only showing you one. And it eventually will make its way back up, and it will dump into the veins very close to the heart. Well, if you think about it, your total volume of blood is only about 5 liters. So look at this, 3.6 liters per day of excess fluid is almost as much total blood as you have. So you can see the lymphatic system has to constantly return excess interstitial fluid back into the cardiovascular system. Otherwise, you've got no blood. And so again, it's these Starling forces that are working in opposition to one another. The hydrostatic force is pushing fluid out, and the osmotic force is bringing it back in. And as we progress through the capillary, you can see that that hydrostatic force is dropping off. Okay. This is a slightly better depiction of the lymphatic capillaries that are in here amongst the systemic capillaries. These things are highly permeable. They're even more leaky than the cardiovascular capillaries, but now the hydrostatic pressure is actually greater on the outside, and as a result of that, it's going to push these flaps open and force the excess interstitial fluid into the inside, because now the pressure gradient is high hydrostatic pressure outside, low hydrostatic pressure inside. Now, these things are found throughout the body with a few exceptions. You don't have any lymphatic capillaries in bones or teeth or in the central nervous system. And so the excess interstitial fluid in the central nervous system actually becomes part of the cerebrospinal fluid and gets reabsorbed later on. Now, here you can see some of these lymphatic vessels, and they will kind of coalesce and come together. They converge into trunks and ducts. And here you can see, look, they dump in again, as we said, up here very close to where the heart is. And so this is the subclavian vein, and this is the internal jugular vein. And so you can see that where they dump in. Here's one of the major ducts of the lymphatic system. It's the thoracic duct. And then over here we have the right lymphatic duct. And now you can again see a little bit more closely where they dump in here right at the junction before we get to the subclavian and the internal jugular veins. And then they dump immediately into the superior vena cava and then right into the right atrium. So we've moved that back into the cardiovascular system very quickly as we do that. Well, what's this bean-shaped thing? This bean-shaped thing, not surprisingly, is a lymph node. They tend to not be very big, not even quite as big as a vein. What are the locations of these? Well, again, you find them in the neck, and so those are the cervical lymph nodes. You find them in the axilla. Those are the axillary lymph nodes, and then you find them in the groin or the inguinal region, and so those are the inguinal lymph nodes. Now, you do find lymph nodes in other places as well, so that's not the only place, but that's where there are clusters of them that are reasonably close to the surface. What are the jobs of the lymph nodes? Well, one of the jobs is filter lymph. And as it does this, it's going to remove microorganisms. The lymphatic tissue is mostly lymphocytes, but there are also macrophages in there. So as the lymphocytes attack and kill things, now the macrophages are going to break it down and help to get rid of it. The other thing that happens here in the lymph nodes is that we activate the immune system. And so as we'll find out later on when we start to talk about the immune system, the lymphocytes have receptors on their surface, and antigen will bind with receptors, particularly in what are known as helper T lymphocytes. And they're going to activate them, and they'll release all kinds of chemical signals known as cytokines. They're hormone-like signals that really kind of activate and ratchet up your immune system and try to get it to help to make you well or even keep you from getting sick in the first place. Now, again, T lymphocytes are constantly recirculating between blood, lymph nodes, and connective tissue. They even move out into the connective tissue, which is the site of infection quite frequently. All right, again, tonsils, secondary lymphatic structures. How many tonsils are you born with? And the truth is that you have several sets of tonsils, and so I do want you to name them. You have these pharyngeal tonsils that are here. They're actually at the back of the nasal cavity, and so here's the nasal cavity, and they're back in there. And then you have palatine tonsils that are at the back of the oral cavity. They're back in there. You have lingual tonsils that are at the base of the tongue. Lingual means tongue. And then you have some others that are known as tubal tonsils. And again, up here in the nasal cavity, you have an opening that comes from the inner ear. And those tubal tonsils are found around that opening from the inner ear, the eustachian tubes. Here you can see a picture of those palatine tonsils. When you open your mouth and say, ah, they're the ones right at the back of the throat that the doctor might be looking at. Tonsils form a ring around the entrance to the throat. And here you can see half of that. So here are the pharyngeal tonsils. There are the tubal tonsils. Again, we're at the back of the nasal cavity. Here are the palatine tonsils at the back of the oral cavity. And then the lingual are at the base of the tongue. And so here you can see 1/2 of that ring. It'll come up on the left side as well to complete that ring. And this helps to protect against pathogens that are in food or air. And when I say food, I'm including liquid as well as solid food, so not just that. Here you can see those palatine tonsils when a person does indeed have an infection. And back when I was a kid in the 50s, they would remove the tonsils really easily. So if somebody got tonsils that were swollen, inflamed, and painful, oh, cut them out. Well, nowadays, they're much more hesitant to do that. They're the first line of defense of your immune system, so it makes sense that we don't want to take them out unless it's absolutely necessary. Here you can see these palatine tonsils. When they become enlarged, they're referred to as adenoids. And now you can see, look how big they are. And so they're actually creating this obstruction at the back of the nasal cavity. And they're even covering up that opening to the eustachian tube. And occasionally people even have adenoids removed. Now we move on to the spleen. It used to be that we believed that the spleen was the seat of emotion, not the heart. And so now what we have to do is get back to correcting things and saying, oh, I love you with all my spleen, and stop saying heart. Or you need to say, you broke up with me and you broke my spleen. And so again, the spleen is the real site of emotion. What we see going to the spleen and being filtered there is primarily the blood. And so foreign substances in the blood can actually stimulate an immune response because there are both B and T lymphocytes located in the spleen, but again, also macrophages. And so as the B and T lymphocytes kill stuff, the macrophages can break it down and get rid of it. And this is also where immune surveillance will go on. And if you walk around campus, we've got those cameras all over the place, both inside and outside of the buildings. So if you don't behave yourself, we can keep track of it and know. Well, your immune system is surveilling as well, looking for things like cancer cells and other microorganisms that can make you sick. And most of the time, the immune system is going to recognize those, attack them, and get rid of them before you do get sick, but not 100%. The spleen is also responsible for taking out those aged red blood cells. Again, they only live about 120 days. It will also get rid of old platelets. And then again, as they get broken down, the macrophages will eat up the debris and other foreign material. So red blood cells and platelets, not foreign material, but microorganisms can be foreign material that you have there. The spleen is actually also a blood reservoir, and they've found that when people do intense prolonged exercise, the volume of the spleen can decrease by as much as about 50%. That's because the extra blood is leaving and adding to the circulation to help get blood to the muscles. Okay, the spleen helps to store some extra platelets and monocytes. Don't forget, we'll talk about this again more later on, but the monocytes actually move into the connective tissue and change into macrophages. And in the fetus, the spleen is responsible for erythropoiesis, or the development of the red blood cells. And then finally, if you like meat a whole lot, here are some slices of bacon-wrapped spleen. And so you throw those on the barbie and roast them up, and boy, is that good, huh? Okay, and then we'll finish up by just looking here quickly again at the spleen. The spleen gets a fairly large supply of blood coming through the splenic artery, and then it's drained through the splenic vein. And then here you can see some histology of this. And so that brings us to the end of the lymphatic system. And next we're going to go ahead and we're going to start to talk about the immune system and immunity.